Grab your coffee and get ready because today we're jumping into a case that remains unsolved despite being the largest murder investigation conducted by the Metropolitan Police since the Yorkshire Ripper. It involves a beautiful and smart TV journalist and many theories that never really panned out, leading us to wonder what really happened even 25 years later. So let's take to the notes. Jill Wendy Dando was a journalist and TV presenter for the BBC. She was often recognized for her work, especially for the show that she was currently hosting, which was just starting to take off. It was called Crime Watch. But before we get into her amazing career and how she became a face known to many, we have to talk about her upbringing. Jill was the daughter of Jack Dando and Winifred Mary Jean Hockey. She did have a brother named Nigel, who also went on to be a journalist for the BBC. Jill was used to excelling in almost everything she did. Even as a child in grade school, she was the head girl at her school. She went on to study journalism and was a member of a theater company, the obvious cocktail for being a television presenter. Her whole career was built around being a reporter, specifically. Even her first job was a trainee reporter for the Winston Mercury. After a few years in print, she wanted to do something in news reading, so she transferred to the BBC radio division. Here she was the anchor for the hour bulletin, and she continued to do this for a few years. At the time, she was involved in presenting the 1 o'clock and 6 o'clock news, as well as a travel program, and of course, Crime Watch was just starting. Things were really taking off for Jill, and she was the focal point of the network. April 26, 1999 was supposed to be just like any other day. She was scheduled to present the 6 o'clock news the following day, had booked a gig to host the British Academy TV Awards that year, and had just wrapped recording a series that would soon air called Antique Inspectors. However, the morning of April 26th would be very different than any other day. That morning, the 37-year-old left her fiancé's house and drove to her home from Chiswick to Fulham, which is about 3 miles apart, so a short drive. She arrived at her home at 11:32 a.m., and when she reached for her front door, she was shot once in the head. Bob Wilfenden from The Guardian reported, quote, "As Dando was about to put her keys in the lock of the front door of her home, she was grabbed from behind. With his right arm, the assailant held her and forced her to the ground so that her face was almost touching the tile of the porch. Then, with his left hand, he fired a single shot at her left temple, killing her instantly. The bullet entered her head just above her ear, parallel to the ground, and came out right on the other side of her head." Unquote. Within 10 minutes, she was found by her neighbor Helen, and the police were called. Other neighbors were asked about what they heard and saw, and one neighbor, named Richard, said that he had heard a scream, but it sounded more like someone was being surprised. He did not hear a gunshot, and this could be because the 9mm semi-automatic pistol that was used to kill Jill had been modified. Though Richard didn't know what was happening, he did see a man he didn't recognize, and this would go on to be the killer. He described that man as 6 foot tall, white, and around 40 years old. Obviously, this was a huge deal for many reasons. A life was lost, and one that many people knew. Because of this, there was a ton of media coverage around the case, and a large investigation put on by the police. And though many people knew her, as she was the highest profile BBC reporter on screen at the time, and she was on their TVs every single day, there was speculation as to what would be someone's motive to kill Jill. To help aid in the investigation, BBC's Crime Watch, the show Jill was supposed to be co-hosting, created a reconstruction of her murder. This sparked a large number of people calling in with tips, and just 6 months in, the investigators had contacted over 2,500 people, half of which they took statements from. These tips led the police to heavily focus on a man named Barry George, who lived close to Jill and had a history of stalking and sexual offenses. So let's quickly talk about Barry's upbringing and why police were so focused on him. Barry grew up in London, and following his parents' divorce when he was just 13 years old, he was sent to a boarding school for children with behavioral issues. This continued into his adult life, hindering him from getting any jobs other than that of a messenger at the BBC. He tried once to become a police officer, but was denied and acted out by posing as a police officer. After only being fined €25 for this, he continued on his crime spree, obviously. He later went on to have multiple incidences of indecent assault and rape attempts. He was married at one point, but his ex-wife described the marriage as that of convenience, yet still violent and terrifying. 4 months into their marriage, she reported an assault, and the marriage ended. A psychologist who examined him did say that she believed he had a few different personality disorders. With this in mind, the police really had their eye on him, and part of their focus on him was putting him under constant surveillance. He was eventually arrested and charged with her murder on May 28th. Originally, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but many thought that there wasn't enough evidence against George. His team appealed 3 times. The first 2 were unsuccessful, but the third was successful due to discredited forensic evidence that was excluded from the trial. And though Barry was connected to her through the BBC as well, and had a clear fascination with celebrities and had multiple personalities, they really couldn't definitively connect him to the case. Because of this, Crime Watch stopped accepting information concerning Jill's case. But many knew Barry's name and his face at this point. Newspapers continued to report on him as if he was guilty, and this led to him pursuing libel action against these news sources. Here are the facts that we know about what actually happened on the day of Jill's death. The postman delivered to Jill's house about half an hour before she arrived, and he claims to have noticed that he was being watched by a man with dark hair in a suit. Also, a traffic officer who was ticketing a Range Rover that was illegally parked was approached by the car's owner when they came to shoo off the police officer. Both the dark-haired man in the suit and the Range Rover were seen by quite a few people within the next hour. After Jill was shot, 2 neighbors say that they saw a man in a dark suit with black hair running away from the house. And just a few minutes after she was shot, the Range Rover was caught on CCTV footage speeding away. With the known facts about Barry being cleared, this urged the police to look into new leads and new theories. According to Jill's Wikipedia page, here are the theories that were looked into and why they didn't work out. Initially, they thought an ex-boyfriend or ex-lover were the killer, but this was ruled out by interviewing her friends and checking her phone records with no proof of a jealous ex. When that didn't work, they looked into someone hiring an assassin to murder her. The thought was that they would have been motivated by Crime Watch, bringing attention to certain cases, but this was discredited because the CCTV footage showed that she was not being followed, so eventually it was ruled out. There were floating theories that it was a communist revenge against media outlets, but that was a little bit far-fetched. Another theory, and one we've seen in a few other cases, was that there was an obsessed fan who wanted to kill Jill after she denied them attention. Her brother even said that Jill had told him she was concerned about some guy who was pestering her, but still this was ruled out by detectives. They looked into mistaken identity, but how could someone know her address and know who she was and still mistake her identity? This too was ruled out. Some thought that a recent pedophile ring she was covering on the BBC led her to be the target of a bad group of people, but again, there was no evidence to support this. So finally, they looked into a jealous colleague. Even her agent was interviewed as a suspect, but eventually this too was ruled out. With every theory looked into and little evidence found, the case became cold. But in 2019, the case was reopened with new leads. It was revealed that there were over 100 potential suspects that were never followed up with. And when they finally were followed up with, one claimed to know who killed Jill. The man, whose identity is a mystery, said that he believes it was the work of someone professional, based on the gun and the way that she was shot. That same man was given the list of suspects and said he knew a few people on the list, and one in particular stood out due to how much danger surrounded their name. This man also said he wanted to stay anonymous because he was worried that if he spoke out, they would come after him next. They also followed up with Helen, the neighbor who found Jill dead, and she agreed that it did seem like a professional hit. The man looking into the case in 2019, who had the anonymous interviewee and circled back with Helen, was a man named Mark William Thomas. He was an investigative journalist. While doing press about this case, Mark said he believes that it was a hit placed on Jill because of her work on Crime Watch, saying, quote, "There are some very nasty, horrible people out there, criminals, and the crucial element from their point of view is that they may perceive that Crime Watch puts criminals away, therefore putting their friends and colleagues away, and I think that was the reason," unquote. He also worked with the police to get this case reopened, to have them take a fresh look at the case after all these years. Following her death, the BBC aired her show Antique Inspectors and dedicated it to her, though they canceled it following its last episode recorded by Jill. A funeral was held for Jill on May 21st, 1999, and her co-presenter on Crime Watch and her fiancé raised €1.5 million to start the Jill Dando Institute of Crime Science at the University College in London. The BBC also created a memorial garden in her memory, as well as started a scholarship for broadcast journalism in her name. At Weston College, where she studied, a new building was created and named after her. Finally, on the 20th anniversary of her death, BBC broadcasted a documentary about her life, her death, and her legacy. If you have any details pertaining to this case or to any of the suspects named, please contact the Metropolitan Police in London. That's it for this week. If you have a case you want me to cover or have thoughts on this week's, DM me on Instagram at MeganTheMorningPodcast. Let me know which theory you think is the true reason behind why Jill was killed, or how. And I'll be back in 2 weeks with another Hollywood true crime case.